told you that the Kent State Massacre should not have occurred. On May 4th, 1970, the Ohio National Guard opened fire on a group of college protesters. 4 unarmed students were killed. The days and weeks leading up to the incident were filled with conflicts and attempts at compromise. If either the protesters or the National Guard could have realized the other's point of view, 4 students could have survived.
The extension of the Vietnam War into Cambodia in April of 1970 led to the student protests on college campuses throughout the United States. In May 1970, at Kent State University in Ohio, the conflict escalated when the National Guard opened fire on a group of these college protesters. On April 20th, 1970, President Nixon went on record saying that he was withdrawing 150,000 U.S. troops from North Vietnam. This was an attempt at compromise. This should have made protesters happy. However, U.S. troops would then increase the combat capabilities of the South Vietnamese Army so they could take responsibility for North Vietnam. On April 30th, 1970, Nixon ordered troops to invade Cambodia. Nixon believed that the Cambodian people were using neighboring countries to launch attacks on the U.S. soldiers in Vietnam. Nixon made his decision without notifying his Secretary of State or the Defense Secretary. Congress accused the president of illegally taking too much military action without Congress's involvement. This action caused conflict and protests arose across the nation. On the campus of Kent State University, reactions were similar to that of the rest of the nation.
On the next day, several groups on the Kent campus organized what were intended to be peaceful protests. Later on the evening of May 1st, violence broke out in Kent, causing property damage. The crowd blocked traffic and began to break windows. The mayor of Kent, Leroy Sharon, declared a state of emergency. Kent police confronted the crowd and tried to clear the area, using tear gas and nightsticks. 14 people were arrested and several $1,000s of damage was reported.
The next day, there were rumors that the Kent State ROTC building was to be targeted by students. A curfew was imposed from dusk to dawn, and the students were confined to campus. The mayor alerted the Ohio National Guard. University officials were not told that the Ohio National Guard was called in.
About 8 p.m., 300 people gathered on campus where a few speeches were given. From there, a march began, and now 2,000 students surrounded the ROTC building. Windows were broken, and it was eventually set on fire. Firemen arrived on the scene, but they were unable to extinguish the fire because the crowd attacked them and damaged their equipment. The fire died out, and the firemen regained control, only to have the building set on fire a second time. Police joined the scene and dispersed the students with tear gas so firefighters could extinguish the blaze. The Ohio National Guard chased students into university buildings.
This is an eyewitness account from a Kent State University student and a Vietnam veteran, Dale Patak.
And there was a rumor that they were going to do something drastic like that, and they did. And the building was, half of it was the art building and half was the ROTC building. But the students, they had it very well planned. They got in the way of the fire department, so they couldn't get there as quickly as possible. So it ended up, the whole building was ruins. They burned the art building and the whole building was total loss.
May 3rd started off quietly. However, Ohio Governor James Rhodes arrived in Kent. Rhodes claimed that the Kent State demonstrators were organized by revolutionaries who were trying to destroy higher education in Ohio. Later, a National Guard commander told his troops that Ohio law gave them the right to shoot if necessary. At 8 p.m., a crowd gathered. The National Guard officials announced that a curfew was now in existence. The crowd refused to leave. At 9 p.m., the Ohio Riot Act was read, and tear gas was fired from helicopters. Students demonstrated that the curfew was unnecessary. They peacefully marched and were met by the guardsmen. The students asked to speak with the mayor and Kent State University president. However, the guard announced an imminent curfew was in effect and tear gas was once again used to disperse the crowd back to their dormitories.
When I got wind that the National Guard was on the way. I had seen enough of Army, so I packed up my car and left before the shootings. I never went back.
On May 4th, about 200 students gathered on campus. As the day progressed, the crowd increased to 1,500. Upon orders from Ohio Assistant Adjutant General, an Army jeep was driven in front of the assembled students. The students were told to disperse. They did not disperse, and responded with chants. The guardsmen were ordered to disperse them. The guardsmen with loaded M1 rifles and tear gas formed a line towards the students. The students ran away. Some students lobbed tear gas canisters back at the troops. The guard continued marching down the hill onto a football field. For 10 minutes they stayed in this position. Most of the students were watching from Taylor. Several members of the guard knelt and aimed their weapons at the students in the parking lot. General Canterbury concluded that the crowd had been dispersed and ordered the guard to retreat. About 12 guardsmen huddled together briefly and then to the parking lot, where the most vocal students were located. The students assumed the confrontation was over. Many students began to walk to their next classes.
Roughly 12 members from Troop G simultaneously turned around, aimed, and fired their weapons into the crowd. A total of 67 shots were fired in 13 seconds. 9 students were wounded, and 4 students were killed.
The National Guard was kids that were very ill-trained, and they didn't need live ammo. I mean, they could have got away with just their weapons with no ammo and bayonets or just force. I mean, it was kids against kids.
Immediately following the shootings, the campus was closed for approximately 6 weeks. Requests for an investigation of the events on May 4th, 1970 were made by members of the university and the government. On May 19th, a commission under leadership of Charles E. Kelgley was formed to prevent and eliminate violence on campuses. On June 6, Ohio passed a new campus riot bill prior to opening the campus for its summer session.
James Masterson, another Vietnam veteran and former Kent State student, had these thoughts to share about the shooting.
There was a lot of dissension in this country. I guess I didn't know a lot about it because due to the fact that I was in the service for those 2 years when a lot of these things started happening. But, you know, again, some of it had to do with the troops coming home and so forth that weren't treated properly. And I think the students had no comprehension of just what a soldier had to go through when he was in Vietnam. But overall, I just think that it had to do with the peace movement here, and then I think the students just felt that, you know, we needed change.
Over the next several years, a series of lawsuits were brought to court against the National Guard for the killings. It was not until 1979 that a settlement was made with the families of the victims. Part of the settlement included a statement from the defendants that reads, "In retrospect, the tragedy of May 4th, 1970 should not have occurred. We deeply regret those events and are profoundly saddened by the deaths of 4 students and the wounding of 9 others, which resulted." Could the tragedy at Kent State have been avoided? At a time when tensions all across the country were becoming sharply divided over the war, passion and irrational behavior prevailed over cooler heads. The conflict over the U.S.'s involvement in the war continued to escalate, and the few compromises offered seemed to do little to ease the emotions. It was a time for all involved to take a step back, take a deep breath, and start a conversation. Unfortunately, that conversation began after the shooting, and it continues to this day at the Kent State University campus.
Finally on